Hello and welcome to today's featured morning session.
Our next speaker has a storied history with TRC consultants and PHDwin internationally. For a long time we have wanted to share the story behind Maersk Oil. Maersk Oil had the challenge of becoming SPE-PRMS compliant with hundreds of employees, dozens of departments, and over 7 countries.
We hope you will enjoy the presentation. We would like to extend a special thank you for Richard Smith for joining us today for this special presentation. Please help us in welcoming Richard Smith.
Hello and good day. My name is Richard Smith. I'm happy to be part of PHDwin Week 2024. My presentation today tells the story of how Maersk Oil, a Danish company that had never been SPE-PRMS compliant in reserves reporting, became reserves compliant in less than 9 months, and the entire Maersk portfolio, including contingent and prospective resources, in less than 17 months. This in itself may not sound unique or exceptional to those of us who have grown up with PRMS and reserves. However, considering the issues in changing an embedded system that was not comfortable with the U.S. defined regulations of the SPE, PRMS, and the SEC, did not want to change the Maersk system used for a few decades. To my knowledge, few companies have successfully made the transition as quickly as Maersk. As you will hear in this presentation, consequences of the company of ultimately knowing the short and long-term financial outlook of their business led to one conclusion. A little about me. I'm a registered petroleum engineer in the state of Colorado. I have been the president of Integrated Reservoir Management, located in Denver since 1993. I was hired by Maersk in 2009 as the Director of International Petroleum Development. I sat as a board member on the Society of Petroleum Evaluation Engineers in the London chapter from 2016 through 2018. I'm considered an expert in reserves, integrated studies, simulation, field management, and litigation. I have been an advisor, a manager, and a consultant to national oil companies, including Petróleos de Venezuela, ADNOC, ADMA, and ZATCO in the United Arab Emirates, the Kuwait Oil Company, and Qatar Petroleum. I managed and delivered the annual reserves reports for A.P. Møller Maersk boards for nearly 5 years. I was the only licensed petroleum engineer in the Maersk organization. A little history behind Maersk. Maersk is a Danish company that's listed on the Danish Stock Exchange. Investors became concerned in 2009 with the performance of Maersk Oil as a unique entity and began to try to make comparisons with US-based SEC-registered companies and started to compare itself against companies like Apache, Marathon, and Oxy, but lacked the precision of reporting to do so. Here you can see a distribution of the reserves volumes of gross production by operator, and you can see where Maersk is in orange with an operated volume of 626,000 barrels of oil a day. Maersk recognized that to compete competitively on a global scale, Maersk needed to align itself with international industry standards and practices. So in early 2010, walking back from lunch with Maersk Oil CEO, I was asked 2 critical questions. Is Maersk Oil PRMS and SEC compliant? And the answer was no. Second question was, could Maersk submit a compliant reserves report by April 15th, 2010? And my answer was, only if we start no later than June 1 and we hire capable staff and name a reserves manager. Maybe we can. So to look at the state of affairs of Maersk at the time, Maersk lacked the corporate guidance and experience for setting a corporate reserves discipline. Lack of departmental communication and shared knowledge between business and operation units was widespread. The challenge at Maersk was as much a people challenge as it was a technical one. Groups traditionally worked with little supervision or corporate oversight. There became a fairly high level of resistance for management. We all know that organizational change is difficult, and at Maersk, half of the stakeholders were opposed to SPE-compliant reserves processes. Part of the challenge was getting people to align regardless of their different titles, department, or responsibilities. So in early 2010, we performed an outside audit of Maersk's reserves process. And what was the audit opinion of Maersk Oil's reserve process? Well, first of all, reserves in Maersk were based on internal definitions versus common definitions commonly found in GAAP, PRMS, and SPE standards. It was also found that the evaluators lacked a unified standard of form of evaluation and consistency. However, it was noted that the individuals doing the analysis and evaluations had the right intention, but their execution was inconsistent because they didn't have the consistent methods across all the business units. There were a number of key issues identified. Volumes tended to be non-compliant from the mapping and the geology and geophysics, and they were not compatible with international industry standards. Accounting discrepancies existed as well because long-term and short-term financial reports did not align with historical production data in the past or backward-looking forecasts. And it was noted that there was a major misclassification of resources, often reported as reserves. There was a critical procedural misalignment compared to international industry standards. There was a lack of control and documentation. There were critical gaps in standards and training. There was no compliant reserves manual or essential definitions. There was an absence of specific reserves and resources training. There was non-compliant mapping and forecasting. Geological maps were not compliant and did not match well data. And predominantly individual or simulation-based forecasts were not supportable. Finance department responsibilities and disconnect was widespread. Finance department managed economics, financial forecast, and year-end report. There was a lack of cross-functional communication and direction. Finance department managed the economics, financial forecast, and year-end reporting. However, there was no alignment between the departments, especially operations and production. The worst situation observed was that reservoir engineers and field staff were excluded from economic contracts terms and calculations because a dedicated economist was assigned to handle the economic aspects, but not embedded with the evaluators and did not share the details. So there were some major gaps in the evaluation of what was economic and what was not. In addition, there were challenges in the management of costs. It was discovered that costing was oversimplified and made quite easy because of expediency. That was determined to be because Maersk was using only Excel software and it was not compatible with some of the complex contract terms and conditions. In addition, because of Maersk's international operations and many offshore scenarios that it had with other operators and business partners, the complicated and convoluted cost centers associated with platform costs and fuel and flare management were typically non-compliant. So why did Maersk make the decision to move to PRMS and SPE compliance? Well, there was a definitive need identified for international competitiveness. And here, back to this plot, we'll take a look at that again. Maersk had to operate at the same level as leading international competitors to remain competitive. You can see that Maersk had almost 3,500 employees. It included 130 operated licenses. We were in 11 countries, and we operated 626,000 barrels of oil a day. However, when you broke that down by country, you could see that we had 7 major countries and 51 fields identified. But in the 5th column to the right, you can see the reports categories and classes which were desired for our year-end reporting and which were not done as a functional part of day-to-day Maersk business. So on May 31st, 2010, the board approved a plan to become SPE SEC compliant for year-end 2010, which at that time required a dedicated reserves manager, an internal team, and tools to ensure consistency across the organization. Although a 2010 timeline was very difficult, the goal was to submit a compliant report. AP Mueller Maersk boards gave approval to begin hiring a team and purchasing reserve-specific software. I was approved as the first reserves manager for Maersk. Here you can see the basic timeline in the last months of the year, from June to October, October being the training and implementation effort, which was done on a global basis. So in August through September, Maersk allowed the hiring of one assistant, which was all, but it allowed the hiring of outside consultants to provide us with software and reserves experience, which was very definitely required. So no software solution was available for all compliance requirements except one after the evaluation of what was made available on the market. So what was a primary focus to Maersk was the complex production sharing agreements which existed, the complex governmental lease fee terms and conditions which existed, and the cost recovery clauses which existed in many of our contracts. So moving forward, Maersk had a plan to achieve compliance. Beginning in October 10, training and professional implementation began. Maersk required trained personnel in multiple countries. The task at hand was global and faced political challenges beyond just corporate bureaucracy. Training required international travel, and cultural expectations were part of what was planned. Cultural norms related to training for U.S. standard led to resistance, and multiple nationalities from Western European countries and Maersk brought nativist resistance against U.S. rules. Convincing stakeholders PRMS was an international norm was a challenge. As we know, change is never easy, and Maersk was no exception. Maersk was a European and multinational company. SPE and USA rules, predominantly SEC rules, were seen as overbearing and unpopular and not pertinent to European countries. Some senior management pushed back quite hard and became reluctant to encourage change. They were also unwilling to enforce the new standards. Finance and operations were not interested in understanding stakeholder needs outside their departmental roles. And lack of compliance for complex royalty and operating cost structures led to conflicts between reserves processes and finance departments. There was a lack of unified vision. Personnel and upper management lacked control mechanisms to force departmental change, and that meant that a lack of unified vision meant that change came very slowly. It was also noted that operations and finance had a notable lack of synergy. Operations typically focused on production and production only and booking reserves. Finance focused predominantly on cash flow that had very positive budgets. And there was a disconnect between production engineering economics and modeling, which led to aggressive and inflated budgets. It was noted that misclassification of resources ran unchecked at Maersk Oil. Reserve quantities lacked class and categories which would reflect asset risk. Volumes presented in reserves reports are typically overestimated, and they lacked correct determination and were included in reports without technical support. Contingent resources are often mislabeled as reserves, and they are often not substantiated by data. Prospective resources were determined to be quite positive and large and typically highly speculative. Reserves uncertainty was misunderstood. The concept of 1P, 2P, and 3P was misunderstood and hard to correct. Published reserve volumes pre-year-end 2010 were unreliable and non-compliant. The term most probable became a source of major conflict within the company in this process. Maersk reserves previously booked as most probable had a significant risk of misrepresentation. Volumes typically lacked supportive evidence in contrast to conjecture, which was common. Finance look-back volumes included misrepresentations, which led to forecasts having significant look-back differences. Getting the job done, a number of initiatives were required for success. Number one, all evaluators must be trained in the SPE-PRMS reserve system. All volumes must be supported by technical data, and all reserves must meet evidence and economic-based criteria. Here you can see what we determined to be the basic plan for year-end 2010, the delivery year-end 2010 reserves in 2011 on April 15th, deliver on September 30th of the same year, SPE compliant contingent resources of 1C, 2C, and 3C, and October 3rd, year-end 2011 reserves and resources portfolio report, completely making it a complete report. And it led to bigger and bigger things. So Maersk began to identify that on the international business stage, making its reserves and resources known to the public had additional benefits in seeking and achieving partnerships in other projects. You can see here in 2010 where we were in 2012. You can see the major countries in which Maersk had significant volumes of both contingent and prospective, of both reserves, contingent, and prospective resources. Qatar being one of the biggest, Denmark being the second largest, and potentially very, very large reserves in Angola and the USA and Kazakhstan. Norway was still in prospective resources at this time. As discussed earlier, Maersk had major assets of 51 fields in 7 countries. What made the whole process difficult was the economics and cost structures behind dozens of platforms and all the related infrastructure and surface facilities. In addition to that, we had thousands of wells, both injection and producing wells and disposal wells. Most of the fields had complicated and convoluted contracts. Prior to 2010, no international assets were compliant. Each country and asset had unique concepts and methods, and asset teams appeared siloed. Unfortunately, asset teams at that time were not responsible for economics or detailed costing. So the new changes to ensure consistency and compliance were a strict focus on quality in all aspects, no tolerance for substandard work, failure to comply would not be tolerated, and economics and modeling were to be required to be robust and comprehensive. So Maersk Oil Corporate Resource Management System was created. The acronym is called MOCRMS. And so it follows very closely the SPE-PRMS distribution of resources, as you can see on the right. So the new business model required all resources to be defined and reported using the same standards and methods, regardless of the class of resource. New reporting standard had to include all resources, including the same rules and definitions. There was no exception allowed. Here you can see the result of initial planning to get compliance and agreement with all the stakeholders that were involved in the process inside Maersk. On the left side, you can see the number of authorities within Maersk that were identified to cross-collaborate in order for us to proceed with delivery of a reserves report. The x-axis presents a timeline, and you can see in the red arrows where everything comes together and then separates depending on objectives and processes, all arriving in the bottom right to delivery of a report. This is a very simple summary of the process year-end to year start of how the reserves process was managed. Needless to say, this took a tremendous amount of time and commitment, and it was a process that never stopped. One of the things that Maersk corporate management did not recognize was that reserves is a constant process that just doesn't stop and start in October and then in January. So in choosing software, MOCRMS decided that it was going to be PHDwin. It was the only software that could meet corporate reserves needs at Maersk Oil. PHDwin could handle all categories and classes in incremental design, complex and convoluted cash flows and contract terms, and I can only assure you how complex and convoluted some of these contract terms were. It was a fast and stable program, and its ability to be updated on a monthly and yearly basis was very easy. So this process of MOCRMS required relearning across the entire organization, all 7 countries, and basically about 1,000 employees. It involved the differences between reserves, entitlement reserves, and non-reserves resources. So in order to make our process fully compliant and audit ready, the Resource Evaluation Support Package, or called RESP, was created. This was a documentation package which could be handed over in its entirety to a third-party qualified auditor with all of the data and documentation necessarily to certify whether or not we were audit compliant. It had all the technical and financial audit compliant information. It had all the process data that was required, and it utilized the PHDwin tools, which our auditors were also fully compliant in using. The RESP contained all of the essential field information that was required. It contained compliant geological maps for volumetrics, which were very heavily scrutinized. It had all the summarized volumes, not just for the current year, but previous years. And it was provided discussion of key information, changes, and differences from previous reports. All the basic information for compliance was in the RESP, and it went straight to the auditors. So Maersk Oil finally adopts the new standards for compliance. So you can see that the lasting changes were at Maersk Oil in this process. So you see the 4 major objectives for the year. The first PRMS report, consultant audited and approved 1, 2, and 3P reserves. Following that were contingent resources and prospective resources, which are also SPE-PRMS compliant. And then in October 3rd, 2011, was the following year, and that was the kickoff for the next year's process. So the reserve system continues to improve, and the team grows to expand the competency of the group. Maersk begins the transition from the consultant-assisted process to an in-house capability. MOCRT, the Maersk Oil Corporate Reserves team, grows from 2 individuals to 7, which included 2 PhD technicians and programmers, senior reserves engineer and advisor, a senior reservoir engineer, a developmental geologist, and a junior reservoir engineer. So the process leads to lasting corporate governance. So MOCRMS provides tools for continued success. Year-end 2011 changes lead to lasting corporate governance. MOCRMS manual and definitions are published. The MOCRMS process and methods of training were distributed across the entire organization in all countries. A complete set of corporate control documents and processes and quality assurance methods were developed and implemented. Here you can see the basic feedback, which was sent to all the business units, and this was the operation plan for year-on-year compliant reserves reporting. So looking back, how did we get there in 18 months? Well, we began with universal resistance across the corporation. And even though we had anticipated a management of change issue, Maersk began this process of converting to PRMS compliance with universal resistance across the corporation. Although there was enough support in senior management, there were a number of people, both on the board and in other positions, that did not like the idea of management of change, which was originally proposed. In fact, one member actually says, Maersk does not do that. So it became important and very valuable that we began the identification of supporters and adversarial personnel equally to be important. Some senior managers supported the change, and some senior managers enabled resistance. Focusing on moving forward and working closely with supportive staff helps spur the change. So initially, the training was provided by TRC Consulting and PHDwin, and Ryder Scott performed a lot of our training processes and offered expert audit opinions. The change required a lot of politicking, where one business unit, for instance, at Maersk, refused to comply with auditor directions for change, and the resource team was required to make the associate appropriate necessary changes. It was no doubt that TRC consultants and Ryder Scott played a pivotal role. The first-year effort yielded results with step-by-step forward action with critical support from some managers and focused project management and hard deadlines. Objectives were met. The first deadline for fully audited and compliant year-end 2010 1P and 2.3 change finally happened at Maersk. The first-year effort did yield So change finally happened at Maersk. First-year effort did yield results with step-by-step forward action with critical support from some managers and focused project management and hard deadlines. The objectives were met. The consultants of TRC and Ryder Scott played a pivotal role. The first deadline for fully audited and compliant reserves of April 15th was met. So the first year effort did yield results. Deadlines were met, and focused project management allowed us to meet those deadlines. The first deadline for fully audited and compliant year-end 2010 1P, 2P, and 3P reserves was August 15th, 2011. Fortunately, some high-level managers aligned themselves with the program and fully supported the change. However, cultural norms were restricted to enforcement down the line. Some departments or individuals still did not align and were resistant and refused to comply. Eventually, AP Mueller and Maersk board set a get it right or else ultimatum for the expectation of year-end 2013 reporting. Basically, they said if the same audit errors that came through since year-end 2010 would continue, individuals would be possibly subject to disciplinary action. Finally, AP Mueller and Maersk boards had their first Capital Markets Day on October 9th, 2012. Maersk Oil released internationally their audited 2011 1P, 2P, and 1C volumes. That was the success. It allowed Maersk to finally compare itself with the other companies, which you saw in the comparative graph earlier. Successive years of compliant reporting soon followed. One of the outcomes of becoming compliant was a very solid understanding of resource maturation, which followed the basic PRMS 9-square resource distribution. This is an example of subsequent years in this graph showing from 2000 and subsequently a process of resource maturation. Subsequently, a resource maturation process was accepted, which followed the PRMS 9 Subsequently, corporate growth was measured in resource maturation concepts as demonstrated in this graph. From top to bottom, or should I say from bottom to top, you see how resources migrate from prospective resources all the way up into reserves, but by their respective category. This allowed Maersk to fully understand where it was in its processes to move forward. However, even though reserves reporting continued through 2016, Maersk Oil was acquired by Total in a stock and debt trade in 2017. The review and acquisition process proceeded rapidly. Maersk's reserves and resource reports were compliant and audited, which enabled straightforward evaluation. However, compliant practices probably came a little bit too late. Management faced the reality. Maersk's extensive asset portfolio and new practices is not enough to reverse previous years of poor business decisions. Debt and future operational liabilities lead the decision to sell Maersk Oil. The need for a strong evidence-based reserves and resources management system for year-on-year corporate practices must rely on projects that are commercial and depend on a strong economic and technical foundation. The question remains, if Maersk had MOCRMS years earlier, would it have been necessary for the company to have sold its resources? That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Richard, for all the hard work on your presentation.